Hello, everybody. My name is Seth from the world of paleoanthropology. And today I'm here with two very special guests, Molly Selba and Professor Agustin Fuentes. I will allow themselves to introduce and talk about themselves a little bit and hear more about them. Molly, why don't you start?
My name is Molly Selba. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida. I'm a biological anthropology graduate student, and I study cranial morphology. As I finish up my dissertation, I'm also currently teaching anatomy at the high school level. So I work both as a researcher and as a high school teacher.
My name is Agustin Fuentes. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, biological anthropologist. I work on things around human evolution, non-human primates, human primate interactions, multi-species anthropology, and evolutionary theory.
Perfect. And you might recognize Professor Agustin from some previous episodes, as we have had him on before, and we have loved those discussions. So we're happy to have him on again. So basically today we're here to talk about something very important that, as most of you should recognize, is needed within our specific community. Of course, there are other communities where this is less needed and some where it's even more needed. But for the world of paleoanthropology and our viewership, what is race, sex, and gender is a very important topic because some people seem to just not get it. And that's okay, but we're here to educate you and provide a framework for you to better move forward. So today, that's what we're going to be talking about. And let's keep everything professional, adult, and, up to our expectations. So first off, and I'm going to angle this question kind of towards Agustin, is what is biological race? Because people think race is a lot of things. So what actually is race that we're talking about in this sense?
So let's actually change that slightly and ask, what is not race?
Okay, perfect.
Here's what is not race: Black, white, Asian, African, European, Asian. Those concepts, when we're talking about biology, those are not biological races. So the point here, race as it is commonly used is not a biological way of dividing up humanity. Now, race as it is used and as it is experienced and lived every day is a social, political, and very real construct, a social reality that we all fit in. It matters when you walk down the street, whether you're white or Black or Asian, but that mattering is social, historical, and political. It is not biological, right? So the bottom line here is that biological race is not Black, white, Asian, African, European, Asian. Humans do not divide up biologically by any characteristic into those clusters.
So then, to play devil's advocate, what would you say to those people that are like, well, forensic anthropologists can tell the difference between races and identify them by their bone structure?
So here's a very good example. In the United States, right, or let's take North America, USA and Canada, a forensic anthropologist or someone like myself who's actually worked and been trained in this context could take a bunch of skulls and a bunch of metrics, right? I'd take a certain measurements of skulls and I could classify them, right, into these categories of Black, white, Asian, maybe some others that we use in the US as well. I could not get into greater detail than that. I could in some cases, and I could do so with about 80 to 85% reliability. That means, you could tell whether a skull is Black or white with about 80, 85% in contemporary humans. Now, I could take those same measurements on a set of skulls from 1895 in the northeastern part of the United States and 1995 in the northeastern part of the United States, 100 or so years apart, and they will be as easy to tell apart. They will be as different as the contemporary things we're calling races today. The bottom line, and if I went to, let's say, India and tried to use these same classifications, or I went to any place in Africa and tried to use these same classifications, they wouldn't work in the same way. The bottom line is that what forensic science compares are certain morphologies, right? And certain measures that we have in a database, and then we compare against that database. They do not measure biological groupings in any way, shape, or form, and they're not always consistent, and they have changed over time.
Perfect. And Molly, studying cranial morphology, going along with that, is that what you would agree with as well, as far as skulls go?
Yeah, so I study facial reduction in primates, bats, and dogs. I don't typically work with human primates, so that's not something that I do as part of my research. But yes, everything that Dr. Fuentes just said is exactly how it's kind of viewed currently in the field of biological anthropology.
Okay, and my apologies on the confusion there.
No, but there's a really important thing. You got to know, what are the actual data? Like, what is biological variation in humanity, right? And once you understand that, you recognize that a forensic database, right, that are used by law enforcement agencies or things like that, are built up out of dividing people up first, putting them into categories, and then matching suspects or matching deceased individuals to those categories. And that they vary around the world. Like a forensic database from the United States is not sufficient in Brazil or South Africa, for example. They don't work. And that's because of the contemporary variation. It's a long story, but let's just say, if for the readers or the watchers who want to check this out, go through some reading about human cranial variation and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and it'll be pretty evident.
Awesome. I love that. Okay, so now we're going to turn from race a little bit towards sex and gender. And, this particularly is a section that I really want to elaborate on, and that I personally have learned a lot on since coming up with the idea that we needed this. And to whoever wants to answer, we have sex and we have gender, and a lot of people think they're interchangeable. And are they not? What are they?
So I'll dive in. So this is something that is important to me, both as somebody who's taught human sexuality and culture, as somebody who's currently teaching high school anatomy. I am happy to get to speak on this subject. So sex and gender, although they're sometimes used interchangeably, are two completely different things. And especially when you're considering them in a paleoanthropological context or a forensic context, it's really important to understand those differences and not conflate the two terms. So when we're talking about sex, we're talking about kind of our biological reality. And a lot of people might think, oh, okay, so you're saying you're either biologically male or biologically female, and it's actually not that. It doesn't fall into those discrete categories at all, but I'll kind of circle back to that. Gender is much more about your lived experiences and how you see yourself in the world. It's, based largely on social and cultural constructs, and it's very much a lived experience, and it's not based on your biology at all. So when we're looking in the fossil record or from a forensic standpoint, we can't really speak at all about that person's lived experiences, so we really can't speak to their gender. So when we're looking at any type of osteological remains, if we can understand anything, we're going to be talking about sex specifically. And even sex doesn't fall into those clear male and female binary, categories that sometimes we're led to believe. There is hormonal sex, there's chromosomal sex, there's your primary and secondary sex characteristics. So about your anatomy, there's all sorts of different elements that come together to kind of form our biological sex. And these things don't exist as, you're purely male or purely female. You can have hormones and chromosomes that act sort of differently. There's many intermediate stages, and embryologically we start out not being, purely male or purely female. We start in this kind of indeterminate form and then develop sex characteristics later on. So it's this much more complex idea than this pure biological male and female.
That's such an important and eloquent way to sort of lay it out, because it reminds us that when we think about our lives today, right, when we think about male, female, or that entire spectrum, or however we want to talk about gender roles and sort of biological processes and patterns, it's complicated. It's like really complicated, and it's lived and it's diverse. And so when people make simplistic assertions about male, female as these separate sort of different trajectories, the biology just doesn't support that. And clearly, and everyone in their own lives knows this, neither does the cultural gendered realities.
And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize. It's easy to point something out that you see, but it's a lot harder to understand things that you don't necessarily see but are happening, in the brain and the personal identification of the person and things like that. So we've already explained the next question, which Molly did perfectly on, so we'll skip to that one. So going back to races, you talked a lot about the differences being like you could compare them from the United States to India and they'd be different, but they'd still be within, normal human range, and they'd be, etc. What causes the superficial changes in people around the world that people classify today as race? So for example, you see you don't need an example, go for it.
No, actually, I wanted to interrupt you, because even asking that question, that frame, let's step back for a moment. What you really want to say is, A, what does human biological variation look like? Right? That's the biology, that's the science, right? B, how do people classify people? And does that classification system actually match to any biological patterns of variation, right?
Okay.
So here's the interesting thing. So skin color is used in this country, right, to classify race all the time. Skin color is not biologically doable or workable to group people into anything aside from ancestral distance relative to the equator. Right? So there are dark people around the planet, there are light people around the planet, and those patternings have to do largely with different patterns of ancestry. And those ancestries are not exclusive to, say, the African continent, right? South Asia, Southeast Asia, and South America also have indigenous populations and populations with that would be classified as dark. In fact, light is much more rare for humans, light skin color, and that's found in very, very far northern latitudes. So there's that. Hair type, face form, nose structure, eye pattern, tooth pattern, all of these things, not a single one of them maps to sort of like Africa, Europe, Asia, or black, white, Asian. So what's really interesting about this whole concept is that if you just look at human biological variation, then you see that this whole concept of race is made up and imposed. And then the question you're asking is, well, then why do we get different skin colors? Well, that's really fascinating, because living closer to the equator for thousands of years puts particular evolutionary pressures on the bodies, right, which the bodies respond to with melanin distribution and particular patterns of melanocyte distribution, which makes your skin darker. So most humans, for most of human history, have had darker skin. When humans moved into more northerly areas where the UV light is not intense, you see lighter skin, because we still need some UV light to produce vitamin D and achieve health. And the same story can go for a huge range of different characteristics that we use to classify people into race erroneously. So those things that people think tell us race and we can use to classify people are actually wrong. And why does that happen? Because most people have no idea what biological variation actually looks like around the planet. So that's knowledge, right? Science and knowledge actually totally refutes the notion that biological races currently exist in humans.
And that brings up a very simple question that I want to ask. I want a yes or no answer. So a lot of people on the internet will, there's my cat. I'm in one community specifically that I am in, we have trouble with defending ourselves from white supremacists. And these people, we're 100% white, we're 100% this, and to be frank, we all, meaning everyone alive today, started in Africa and were dark-skinned at one point.
I mean, the genus Homo, not everyone alive today.
Well,
the
yes,
genus Homo,
yes.
Right? So the genus Homo shares common ancestry across the board. But look, the American Society of Human Genetics recently put out a statement saying that the whole concept of racial purity makes no sense genetically whatsoever. Right. No group of humans has ever been racially pure, and all humans share 99.9% of all their DNA identically. So, I mean, you can take off your shirt and drink milk and scream white supremacy all you want. None of that is science.
Right. Okay, perfect. I think that will give the answer we need to those people. Well,
but Seth, I mean, this is this really important thing, this whole idea of understand, what does genetic variation look like? There's no such thing as genetically pure. That makes no sense. I mean, genetically pure human, we all share the same stuff. How do genes move around? What does that look like in human? It's all really fascinating. It just doesn't get us race.
Yeah,
and a great resource if you want to know more about skin color variation and what that looks like biologically. HHMI's Biology of Skin Color video is a really wonderful resource that is accessible to everyone. So if this is something that you're really passionate about, that's a really wonderful place to start.
Awesome. So, I'm learning a lot as we go, and I hope our watchers are as well. Our next question jumps back to sexuality and gender. And the question, Molly, that I had planned aimed for you is not so much a paleoanthropological question, but more of a societal behavioral question. And that is, in the past, as far as we know, so as far as, written history goes, and today, how has gender played a role in society? How has it shaped our world in as little bit of, blurb as you can? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question, and it absolutely has had strong impacts on everyone, especially in situations of health disparities and how different people are treated, granted access to medical care, things like that. Gender has played a very strong role in that. So just, gender is absolutely something that has played a large role in the treatment of people for a long time. It's also very culturally diverse and specific, so I can't really speak to to gender everywhere and throughout written history, because it's very temporally and geographically defined and different depending on when and where you're looking at. But I mean, there's so much interesting research on that I can't do it justice in just a quick synopsis.
Is there anything you'd recommend that our viewers watch or read, or books?
Gosh, not off the top of my head. Dr. Fuentes, I don't know. Do you have a good suggestion for?
Yeah, I mean, there's a book called The Myth of Gender, but I would actually just reach out and read something like Testosterone Rex from Cordelia Fine, or some other related books. Cordelia Fine's work is really fantastic, and she's written a lot on gender and really sort of showing how, hey, look, gender's here, gender's real. We all embody it, we live it, experience it, but it's a lot more diverse and complex, and it's really much more important than I think people give credit for. I just with Matt Gutman and Robin Nelson published a special edition in Current Anthropology, a special session on masculinities, just looking at how complex masculinity is, right? And how it's patterned out over time, sort of an evolutionary time, but how it relates to physiology, and also how cross-culturally different ways of invoking or thinking with and about masculinity and living out masculinities is really important. For people who are interested, seriously interested, check it out. There's all sorts of great sources to think with gender. But as Molly pointed out, I mean, it's really complicated and it's very diverse. And so, you know, I even challenge any of our viewers to say, okay, so you think you have a good handle on gender. Okay, well, what's the range of masculine? Like, what are the patterns of masculinity, even in your own life? Like the people you know, what about femininity? How does this pattern out? How do the people that you know fit into these different areas? It's really exciting how dynamic it is, but it's also depressing when you realize people try to force it into this really limited thing, right, Molly? It's, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what a lot of the conversations that we're having cycles around to, is just like the innate variation within modern humans in all sorts of characteristics and traits, and how they see themselves in the world, and you know, their own biology, all of these things. We need to break away from this idea of either strict binaries, or that humans are supposed to act and look and operate in society, or be, you know, viewed in society in a certain way. That's just not the reality of the situation, and it really has not been ever the reality of the situation. We are a super diverse species, and I think that there's really a lot of beauty in that diversity. So it's, as you said, exciting.
It works for us, right? It's been very successful. Sort of gender diversity has been characteristic throughout time in humanity, and it has worked. And so you have to ask yourself, so when there are a lot of people out there who really want this extreme binary, really want to hold on to very limited gender roles, why? What's going on? We know the biology doesn't support that. We know the cultural patterns don't support that. What is it? That's what I find very interesting. What is it that draws people to want so much these very clear things, when every human has grown up and realizes stuff is almost never clear? We're pretty messy organisms.
And I think that is, you know, we definitely are very messy organisms. And I think it goes just to say plainly that nothing is binary, or at least nothing should be binary. You know, culturally things are, but biologically things are not. And this brings us to where a lot of these issues come from. And that is, you know, white colonialism and things like that. And I wanted to specifically talk about Charles Darwin for a moment, because I know you've done some work with him recently in a book you published with a few of your colleagues. And I wanted to ask, you know, how did what Darwin say shape what some people believe today, and what's wrong with it?
The book you were mentioning, I'm sorry, there's a blatant plug for this book. Wait, no, it's not there. A Most Interesting Problem, there. Right? Edited by Jerry De Silva. It's a fantastic book with a huge range of top scholars, paleoanthropologists, anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists, scholars who work in and around Darwin. And what we did was, for the 150th anniversary of Descent of Man, that famous book by Charles Darwin about humans, we all wrote reflections bringing Darwin's chapters into the present. So it's a great book. But what's the punchline for mine? I wrote on the races of man. But throughout the book, what you see is that Darwin had some racist and really very sexist personal views, right? And even when his science, when he was collecting data, and they actually pushed against and even refuted his own perspectives, they were so strong in his mind that he still went with them. And so the idea for Darwin is that, yes, all humans share a common ancestor, but humans are divided into races, and those races are ranked, right, with Europeans at the top and others below. For Darwin as well, he saw women as intellectually inferior to males, that they just couldn't achieve the kind of quality that males could conceive. And what's interesting is, if you read carefully, the data that Darwin even masters and pulls in refute those assertions. But this is the power of bias, of racism and misogyny. is that even this incredible scholar, this amazing scientist like Darwin, let his racism and sexism push away his scientific expertise and led him to make some assertions that are still common today. The idea that Europeans are different and better than other kinds of peoples, and that men are smarter than women, people deploy that all the time. And many of them say, well, Darwin said it. Yeah, Darwin said it, but he was wrong.
And it's an important kind of thing to bring up, that as scientists, it's always, that's part of why it's important to address and reflect on our own inherent biases, because living in the world today, you know, you do have inherent biases. So it's super important to reflect on those and not have it impact your science.
And Seth, you pointed out like this historical notion. So the history of European colonialism, right? The sort of concepts of white supremacy, the horrors, the atrocities of slavery and the mass genocide of indigenous populations. That's all part of the history, right? And so thinking with that and trying to understand that and how those things and those patterns shape the way in which the world is today, that's really important. And that helps us understand why some people still hold on to racist and sexist notions, because coming from those contexts, people justify those actions via racism and sexism. And so you can still see those things in play today. That's the thing. We can't be afraid of history, no matter how difficult it is, because knowledge is power if we use it.
And very much a part of being an anthropologist, I think, is reflecting on the problematic history of our own discipline, right? So anthropology has been used to back phrenology and eugenics and all of these things that we, you know, have done work to have to come to terms with the fact that this field was used in ways that hurt many people. But we can't shy away from that. So I think it's very important as an anthropologist to revisit the more problematic parts of the history of our discipline and, you know, see what went wrong so that we can prevent those sorts of issues from happening again.
Definitely. And it is very important, I think, that you both brought up that, and it's not just our discipline. I think scientists in general need to be aware of their personal biases and the categorical biases that go along with the type of science that they're doing. And be able to move past that is what makes a good scientist, in my point of view, and to really keep all that in mind. But when we see it happen in such prominent people, what can we do as a community to, you know, like help educate against something maybe a prominent person has said? Such as Darwin. Like, what can we do against that?
So, I mean, take, you know, the chapter that I wrote, right? It was a contemporary assessment and reinterpretation and contextualization of Darwin's chapter 7 from Descent of Man on the races of man, to review what Darwin said, right? Not to shy away, to clearly point out how what Darwin was saying was clearly colored by his biases, his culture, and his history, and his own racism. Darwin believed, in spite of his own lived experiences, of this hierarchy of races, and to point that out, but also to point out that the data he collected, that even in that time, he made a mistake, right? His racism blinded him, but there were other people at the time, and even he collected data which refuted and pushed against it. And so this idea of saying, oh, well, it was just that person of that time, everyone was racist then, no, that's not true. And there were data available. But more importantly, how do we learn from that? How do we say, hey, look at the mistakes made? How do we understand those mistakes and move forward? So, I mean, Darwin made some horrendous assertions about humans and particularly about women. And he was wrong, and the data are clear on that. So bring this together, bring this up, acknowledge that when we talk about Darwin, but also talk about everything that Darwin did that was wonderful. Talk about his resilience as a scientist and the kinds of contributions he made while acknowledging his failures. Keep those in dialogue, right? Don't whitewash, literally, the past. Don't just say, oh, well, that person, you know, everyone was racist then. That's never true. That's totally not true. And we got to understand that and acknowledge the weaknesses and biases people had, but also incorporate the positives into our history. It's really hard to do, but we should be rewriting textbooks and teaching, right? And Molly, like, I mean, even in high school, we shouldn't be shying away from some of the horrors of the past as we talk about the stuff. But we should also talk about the science, like what is really engaged and how do we try to take the data and the understanding and acknowledging the horrors, but look forward optimistically.
And I think I was talking to Jeremy De Silva on one of my episodes, and he said, I just lost it, of course. He says something along the lines of, if you, we might have to go to another question because I forgot it. Okay. Always going to be a little bit of that. Welcome to our show. I remember. Okay. So he was talking about how there's this problem, especially within anthropology, and we see this repeat itself over and over again. And I can't even say I'm innocent of it, but where we make certain figures our heroes. And no matter what they do, even if they say this or say that, we excuse them from it, like intellectually, educationally, everything. And there's a big problem with that. And again, facing your own biases and everything, you need to kind of view everything from a broader scope to really see all sides of something before making a educated guess or decision. And, you know, even today, I see a lot of people, I'm not going to name any names, but idolizing certain individuals within the paleoanthropological community. And because of that, their science, in my opinion, is weaker than someone else's.
I mean, yeah, right. I mean, if you idolize the scientist and not the data, the analysis, then you're not doing science, right? That's hero worship or some kind of bias. That's cool. That's fine. But that shouldn't be what's driving you, right? Who do you cite? Who do you talk with? And people should be accountable, right? Everyone's all screaming about cancel culture. It's not about cancel culture. It's about accountability for what you say and do, right? So we need to hold ourselves and others, including the big names in our past and present, accountable. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, wouldn't you hold your own family? Don't you hold, you know, your brother or sister or kids or parents accountable for their actions? Yeah.
Definitely. And I just think a lot of people like, not that there was anything particularly that comes to my mind that was per se wrong with Louis Leakey. A lot of people still, you know, view him as like the king of paleoanthropology. And when he found certain things and claimed they were this or that, everyone believed him, or he fought until they did, at least. And I think we need to just be careful how we view certain situations, whether it is based on gender and sexuality, or if it's a biological question. I think we just need to really, you know, how do we come at this in a way that we can solve it and learn as much as we can from it? Which brings me to a question going back to gender and race again. And it's, so as most people who at least pay a little bit of attention know, there is a big gap in between, you know, like an economic gap, a health gap, a health disparity between different groups of people that we in this country have designated. How does that harm? Does that harm people biologically in the long run? And how does it do so?
Well, I mean, look, race is not biology, but racism has biological impacts, right? We can see in the COVID landscape how horrible, you know, there's no biological reason. There's no inherent endemic genomic reason why the majority of nurses dying from COVID-19 are Filipino nurses. There's no biological or genomic reason why Latinos are dying at a higher rate than other groups in COVID, or that Black Americans are suffering from the morbidity of COVID at higher rates. These are the results of racist structures of health, of society, of exposure, of a variety of different kinds of things. So obviously we need to care about that. But if we really care about it, we got to fix it. That's what people don't want to deal with racial inequity and gender inequity. I mean, and the gender situation, the pay gap, it's consistent. People are like, oh, no, there is, men and women don't make the same pay for the same work on average across the board, right? Why haven't we fixed that? We know the Journal of American Medical Association and doctors around the country are pointing out how systemic racism causes substantial health inequalities and inequities that have huge budgetary and economic impacts that are destroying the society. That's harming everyone in it. Why don't we do something about it? I mean, that's the hard thing. It's easy to talk about it, but it's really hard to get, for example, politicians at the local, state, regional, federal level to say, whoops, this is really bad for everyone, not just the individual who's being targeted, but for everyone. How do we fix it? We need to fix it now.
And Molly, would you say we have the same type of thing going on with gender and sexuality, like people's different sexes?
I mean, absolutely. Dr. Fuentes just covered some of the, gender inequalities that are there. Even looking at things like infant mortality rates across different races and things like that. There are strong impacts, both race and gender, in terms of healthcare disparities that need to be addressed. It's a really important and timely issue that is well evidenced in the science. So getting that, these long-term problems addressed is challenging, but definitely needed.
So this question is, it's very particular, and if you don't feel comfortable answering it, that is fine. What damage do you think certain laws, like the ones passed in Tennessee banning healthcare for trans teens, will have?
Was a question for me, or were you throwing it out there?
Yes, it was for you. It was for you.
I mean, I think that those types of laws passed are very detrimental. For example, suicide rates in the LGBTQ community, especially in adolescents, are very, very high. So without the support needed for young individuals in those communities, we're only going to see that get worse. That I echo those same sentiments with laws and rules about trans athletes. This is still a very big deal. And, as somebody who works with high school students, those are members of our population that need our support. And this type of legislation only hurts students, especially students in the LGBTQ community.
And let's even take that to the next level, Molly, because you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. And then you have to ask, if this is the case, if these laws are the only thing they do is hurt other human beings, is harm them, why does this hate become codified? Why are people so adamant about harming, with all the problems we have in our society, economic problems, infrastructure, like there's so many things going wrong in the US. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and they're spending all their time and effort trying to harm teenagers with high suicide risks and lots of sort of challenges in society already. They're trying to double down on harming them. Why?
And it's interesting too, having gotten to work with, this age students as a group, they are extremely, tolerant and I think that we're going to see some really amazing changes socially and culturally as they kind of come into adulthood and voting age, and they become kind of the next wave of people leading this country. It's really been awesome to get to work with them because they are such a tolerant group. So there is change coming, but I hate to see them being the ones that are, targeted by this type of legislation. But as I am so fortunate to get to work with this generation of humans because they're really wonderful.
That's great. And I really like hearing that. And, you know, it's definitely not the easiest thing for them to have to go through all this on top of, as we were saying, everything else going on in this country and the world. But as you said, Molly, there is hope. There is change coming. So that is definitely something for us all to look forward to. Well, maybe not all of us, but I don't think really are interested in those opinions of those people. But so what is the best way going forward that we educate about sex and gender?
Okay, so for me, I have strong opinions on this. I think comprehensive sex education is an absolute must. Abstinence-only sex education has been shown to be both highly effective and not what is best for teenagers, looking at abortion rates, looking at STD transmission, all of these things. Comprehensive sex education is an absolute must. There are, I can't tell you the number. You might know, Dr. Fuentes, off the top of your head, but it's something like 13 or 19 states actually require their sex education to be medically accurate. It's not at all in the majority of states, which is crazy. So we need factually and medically accurate sex education that's, freely available to the students who need it. As somebody who's gotten to interact with and work with students both at the high school and at the college level, it amazes me the fact that this is not a lot of students end up at college not having had good access to healthcare. And not only kind of circling back to sex and gender, the sex education is often different, based on if you're male or female. And, women are getting a very different, take on sex ed than males are. And that is completely crazy to me. People coming up growing up, not knowing the anatomy that we all have, both male and female reproductive anatomy, safe sex, consent, all of these are such huge things and can, be addressed as part of comprehensive sex education. So that if I had one wish, it would be that was more readily available.
Yeah, I live in California, and I remember in 4th grade, I had a 1.5 hour session of sex education. They split the boys and girls up into different classrooms. So the boys didn't learn anything about the girls, and the girls didn't learn anything about the boys. And it was very quick, and it was very like, this happens, and that was it. And no one really knew anything that was going on. And I think, and it's people my age and, older that you unfortunately see a lot of. It's been around for a while, obviously, but like the rape culture and things going on with that is very prominent in my age group. And I think having a broader and more accurate sex education when we were all younger definitely would have changed that.
And I guess there's tons of really good resources out there as well. So there's lots of kind of self-exploration and reading you can do on your own. But if you are college level, so if you are, a high school student and you didn't have access to good sex education because of, the laws in the states where you lived, I totally suggest that upon going to college, every college has something, a human sexuality and culture, like a kind of intro class like that. Take it. You'll learn so much about yourself and about others. It will really drastically change the way that you see yourself and the world. So if you can and you have access to that kind of class at your local community college, if you're going to college, take a class in human sexuality and culture. It's really will, change a lot of the way that you see the world. It's, a great opportunity. I hate that more people don't have access to that, but if that is something at your disposal, go take an anthropology class. Even if that's outside your major, it will become relevant for you at one point or another in your life.
Very well put. And so when we have gender and race, what is like, because we're getting close to our ending time here, I want to end on a really strong note. If there was, I know Molly, you just answered, so I'll ask Augustine. If there was one thing you could change about how race is viewed today, what would it be?
It's what I said, what it's not, right? Race is not biology, right? So that's the one thing. So, but there's like three things, right? Because race is not biology. So any differences between races, any of those patterns, that's social, cultural, historical, and economic. And we can fix it and change it, right? So that's the one. An understanding what human biological variation looks like. Just because I say race is not biology doesn't mean humans don't vary a lot and that isn't important. So an understanding of that. And then what you said, like not ignoring our history, right? Molly pointed this out as well very eloquently. I mean, let's just dive into our history and recognize it and understand a lot of it is messed up. Let's use that to help us fix today, right? So, I mean, the one thing is race is not biology. So all these patterns in race come from racism and they can all be changed.
Wonderful. And Molly, did you have anything you would, I know you said you had one thing earlier, but was there anything specific you would change about the way this society, this culture views sex and gender?
I think even to bring our, biological differences beyond sex into it, like kind of echoing what I said earlier, if like this having more of an appreciation for the variation within our species, we're a very diverse group, and those are not things to be afraid of. Those are not things to try to force into kind of arbitrary, constructs. That biological variation is both, as you said, has been very successful for us, but is part of the real, beauty and the exciting part about being a Homo sapien here on this planet is that we are super diverse. And that is something like really to be celebrated. So in these times when, you are confronted with somebody who puts their pronouns in their bio for the first time and that confuses you and maybe that makes you uneasy, like think about, ask why and be inquisitive and learn about, why, what does talking about gender do for people? How do you see your own gender? Where did those ideas come from? What reading can you do to be a more informed human and reflect on these things? What do you know about sex? What do you know about gender? What do you know about race? All of these things. Continue to be an informed human, and in places where you see something that seems different from what like get excited about that. Don't shy away from it. Variation in culture and biology is not a bad thing. It's like part of what makes us really a special group.
That is beautiful. And I think, thank you both very much. That is where we will leave off. I can't thank either of you enough for coming on and doing this with me. I think we will have educated quite a number of people by the time we get this out. And I hope, if there's anything I can help either of you with in the future, just let me know. But again, thank you for being on.
It was a pleasure. It's always fun.
Thank you.